In the dignified halls of the Boston Municipal Court, a 71-year-old retired law professor was about to orchestrate the most brilliant legal maneuver of her career. What began as a simple property dispute with a predatory development company escalated when she uncovered a multi-million-dollar real estate scam targeting elderly homeowners. Eleanor Winters wasn't your ordinary senior citizen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For over 4 decades, she had meticulously taught constitutional law, known for her encyclopedic memory and razor-sharp analytical mind. When she encountered evidence of widespread fraud, she had no idea she was stepping into a sophisticated conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government. Eleanor documented a pattern of coercion and manipulation that executives laughed about in private meetings, never suspecting that the confused old lady they mocked was building an airtight case against them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the nearly empty community center as Eleanor Winters adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at the documents spread across the folding table. Despite the late hour, her posture remained impeccable, a habit from decades at the lectern that even retirement couldn't break. Outside, the historic streets of Beacon Hill were quiet, with only occasional headlights sweeping across the windows. As cars passed by, property tax reassessments, she muttered, organizing the papers into precise stacks. Building code violations. Eminent domain proceedings. Each category represented another tactic in what she was beginning to recognize as a coordinated strategy, not the random bureaucratic harassment she'd initially assumed. At 71, Eleanor had lived in her brownstone for over 30 years. The modest home represented not just her retirement security but also her connection to the community she loved. The neighborhood had changed dramatically in recent years, with luxury condominiums replacing family homes and small businesses giving way to upscale boutiques. She'd watched with growing concern as her elderly neighbors disappeared one by one, their properties swallowed by Meridian Development Group. The trouble had started 6 months ago with a seemingly innocuous letter from the city about a property tax reassessment. Eleanor's taxes had suddenly doubled, based on a valuation that bore no relationship to market reality. When she'd visited the assessor's office, she was met with bureaucratic indifference and suggestions that perhaps she should consider selling if the financial burden was too great. Perhaps Meridian Development would be interested, the young clerk had said with practiced casualness. They've been very active in your area. That evening, Eleanor received her first offer letter from Meridian, at precisely 60% of her home's market value. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, and the retired professor's analytical mind began to see connections where others might see only unfortunate timing. She pulled her cardigan tighter against the community center's aggressive air conditioning and focused on the newest document, a notice of building code violations that had arrived that morning. According to the city, her perfectly maintained home suddenly had dangerous structural issues requiring immediate, expensive repairs. The inspector was scheduled to return in 30 days, and failure to comply would result in condemnation proceedings. Ridiculous, she whispered, running her finger along the list of alleged violations. As a law professor who'd specialized in property rights and municipal governance, Eleanor recognized the pattern emerging. This wasn't random harassment, it was a calculated strategy to force elderly homeowners to sell at distressed prices. Eleanor reached for her leather-bound notebook, the same one she'd used to prepare lectures for decades. Her handwriting remained precise as she began documenting dates, communications, and patterns her late husband Thomas would have recognized. The look of concentration on her face, the same expression she wore when preparing for difficult cases during her earlier career as a public defender. Follow the evidence, Thomas had always said. The truth leaves footprints if you know where to look. The community center's custodian appeared at the doorway. Professor Winters, we're closing in 15 minutes. She nodded without looking up, too engrossed in the connections forming in her mind. The same developer. The same sequence of events. The same outcome, elderly residents selling beloved homes for a fraction of their worth to escape mounting pressure from the city. Eleanor packed her documents carefully into her worn leather briefcase, a gift from her law students upon her retirement 5 years ago. As she walked the 6 blocks home, her mind catalogued the neighbors who had already sold to Meridian. Margaret Holloway, 82, who'd lived across the street for 50 years until a sudden tax reassessment and building code violations forced her to sell last spring. Richard and Irene Chambers, both in their late 70s, who'd left after receiving notice that their property was being considered for eminent domain as part of a neighborhood revitalization project. The pattern was undeniable to anyone paying attention. But that was precisely the problem, no one was connecting the dots. Each case was handled by different departments, different officials, different processes. Only someone with a broader view could see the orchestrated nature of these actions. Eleanor's brownstone stood solid and dignified amid the changing neighborhood, its brick facade warm in the glow of street lamps. As she climbed the steps, she noticed another envelope taped to her door, a second offer from Meridian Development. Now 55% of market value. The message was clear: things would only get worse. Inside, she placed her briefcase on the dining room table that had hosted countless dinner parties and student advisement sessions over the decades. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding legal volumes and framed photographs documenting a life dedicated to justice and education. In one prominent photo, a younger Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps celebrating a landmark housing discrimination case she'd won for low-income residents. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She wouldn't be intimidated. Not after facing down skeptical judges and hostile opposing counsel throughout her career. Not after building a reputation as one of the most formidable legal minds in Massachusetts. Eleanor made herself a cup of chamomile tea and returned to the dining room, spreading the documents across the polished mahogany surface. She needed more information, not just about her own situation, but about the broader pattern. If Meridian was targeting elderly homeowners throughout Beacon Hill, there would be records. Building permits, property transfers, tax assessments, code violations. All public information, if one knew how to access it. Her laptop hummed to life, the screen illuminating her determined expression. At 71, Eleanor wasn't the technological novice that many assumed older people to be. She'd embraced digital research tools long before most of her colleagues, recognizing early how technology would transform legal practice. 3 hours later, the pattern was unmistakable. In the past 18 months, Meridian Development had acquired 27 properties in the neighborhood. 23 had been owned by residents over 65. Each acquisition followed the same sequence: tax reassessment, building code violations, and sometimes eminent domain threats. In each case, the eventual sale price was significantly below market value. Most concerning was the connection to the city itself. Eleanor discovered that Meridian's CEO, Alexander Patterson, had attended Harvard with the current mayor and served on several municipal committees. The building inspector who'd cited her home had previously worked directly for Meridian. The head of the tax assessment office had a brother who served as Meridian's chief financial officer. Eleanor sat back, removing her glasses to rub the bridge of her nose. This wasn't just aggressive business practice, it appeared to be coordinated. Corruption between a private developer and city officials, systematically exploiting vulnerable elderly residents. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed her daughter Caroline, calling from Seattle. "Mom, it's almost midnight there. Why are you still up?" Caroline's voice carried the familiar mixture of concern and exasperation. "I'm researching something important," Eleanor replied, knowing how inadequate the explanation sounded. "Is this about those ridiculous code violations?" "Mom, I told you, just hire someone to fix whatever they're complaining about. Or better yet, consider the offer from that development company. You could move somewhere smaller, easier to manage." Eleanor suppressed a sigh. Caroline meant well, but at 43, she couldn't understand what the brownstone represented: not just a home, but independence, history, identity. "Caroline, this isn't about stubbornness. I believe there's something deeply wrong happening in this neighborhood. Meridian Development isn't just making offers, they're working with city officials to force elderly residents to sell." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "Mr. Blackwell has presented factual information but drawn deliberately misleading conclusions from it. May I approach with documentation?" With the judge's permission, she presented her own folder of documents. The Beacon Hill Preservation Trust was indeed established 3 years ago following my husband Thomas's death. Its purpose was to honor his lifelong commitment to historic preservation by helping elderly residents remain in their homes through repair assistance and property tax support. She presented the trust's financial records. As you can see, the trust provided grants to 5 elderly homeowners for critical repairs they couldn't otherwise afford. It never sought to purchase properties or profit from them. Turning to face Blackwell directly, Eleanor continued. The trust did approach homeowners, not with purchase offers, but with grant opportunities for repairs, the same repairs that Meridian's pet inspectors later claimed violated code. Judge Harrington studied the documents. This appears to contradict Meridian's characterization. "Mr. Blackwell, do you have evidence of actual purchase offers from Professor Winters or her trust?" Blackwell's confidence wavered visibly. We have testimony from one homeowner who understood the trust's approach as an eventual purchase offer. Hearsay about a misunderstanding is hardly game-changing evidence, Judge Harrington observed. Dryly. Is there anything else substantive in your motion? The remainder of Meridian's arguments proved equally flimsy: attempts to discredit elderly witnesses as confused, challenges to Eleanor's standing to represent the community, procedural objections to the scope of discovery. Judge Harrington dismissed each argument with increasing impatience. Mr. Blackwell, this hearing appears to be a transparent attempt to delay the discovery process that is currently underway. That process will continue as ordered. But Eleanor wasn't content with merely defending against Meridian's accusations. After Blackwell finished, she requested permission to present new evidence, the documents Jasmine Torres had provided. As Judge Harrington reviewed the building inspection memo and Patterson's email, his expression darkened noticeably. These documents appear to show direct coordination between Meridian Development and city officials in targeting elderly homeowners for enhanced code enforcement. Blackwell leapt to his feet. Your Honor, we have no way to verify the authenticity of these alleged documents. The special master can address authentication during discovery, Judge Harrington replied. But if verified, these would represent significant evidence supporting Professor Winters' core allegations. He turned to Eleanor. Professor, do you have a witness who can testify to the provenance of these documents? Yes, Your Honor. A whistleblower from the Building Inspection Office is prepared to testify under oath regarding these documents and the special protocols for elderly homeowners. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as reporters frantically took notes. Judge Harrington gavelled for order before addressing Meridian's counsel. Mr. Blackwell, your emergency motion is denied. Furthermore, in light of this new evidence, I am expanding the temporary injunction to cover all properties owned by residents over 65 in neighborhoods where Meridian has active development interests. As they left the courthouse, Eleanor and Caroline were surrounded by reporters shouting questions. Eleanor selected one from the Boston Globe, a serious-looking woman who had covered the story with particular attention to detail. Professor Winters, Meridian attempted to portray you as having financial motivations. Your response? Eleanor's reply was measured but firm. My only motivation is justice for elderly residents who were systematically targeted because of ageist assumptions about their competence. Meridian and corrupt officials believed we were easy targets because of our age. They were wrong. Later that afternoon, as Eleanor and Caroline debriefed with Michael in her living room, a breaking news alert appeared on Caroline's phone. The city's mayor had announced an independent investigation into the building inspection department and its protocols regarding elderly homeowners. They're trying to get ahead of the scandal, Michael observed. Classic damage control. It won't work, Eleanor replied confidently. The evidence trail leads directly to the mayor's office. Independent investigation or not, discovery will reveal the full extent of their coordination with Meridian. As evening approached, Eleanor felt the cumulative exhaustion of the day's events. Despite her determination not to show weakness, Caroline noticed her mother's fatigue. You need to rest, she insisted gently. We've won today's battle. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. Eleanor reluctantly acknowledged her daughter's concern. At 71, her energy wasn't limitless, though she'd been pushing herself as though it were. A brief rest might be prudent, she conceded. As she settled into her favorite armchair, Eleanor reflected on the day's developments. Meridian's desperate attack had backfired spectacularly, strengthening her position while revealing their growing panic. The building inspection documents provided by Jasmine had shifted the case from circumstantial evidence to direct proof of coordination. Most importantly, the unified support of her daughter, former neighbors, and community had transformed what began as one woman's stand against corruption into a movement for elder justice. What Meridian and city officials had failed to understand, what ageist assumptions had blinded them to, was that Eleanor's age wasn't a liability but her greatest asset. Decades of legal experience had taught her how to build an airtight case. Years of teaching had honed her ability to present complex information persuasively. A lifetime of facing and overcoming dismissive attitudes about her capabilities had developed resilience that younger opponents couldn't match. As she drifted toward sleep, Eleanor smiled slightly at the irony. The very characteristic they had weaponized against elderly homeowners, age, had become the foundation of her strength. They had believed her too old to understand their scheme, too confused to document it effectively, too intimidated to challenge powerful interests. Instead, they had encountered a formidable opponent whose lifetime of experience had prepared her perfectly for this exact battle, a battle she was now positioned to win. The morning sun filtered through Eleanor's curtains, casting long shadows across her dining room war table. 3 weeks had passed since the emergency hearing, and the landscape of the case had transformed dramatically. What began as one woman's stand against corruption had evolved into a comprehensive investigation involving state prosecutors, federal housing authorities, and a growing coalition of elderly rights advocates. Eleanor studied the Boston Herald's front page with quiet satisfaction. City Hall shaken, building commissioner resigns amid expanding corruption probe. The accompanying photo showed Commissioner Walters leaving his office with a cardboard box of personal belongings, face tight with barely suppressed rage. First domino to fall, Caroline commented, placing a cup of tea beside her mother. Dad would have loved watching this unfold. Eleanor smiled at the mention of Thomas. He always said that patience was the most underrated legal virtue. Justice moves slowly, but it does move. The investigation had indeed moved slowly but inexorably forward, gaining momentum with each new revelation. Judge Rivera, the special master overseeing discovery, had systematically dismantled the city's attempts to shield communications through executive privilege claims. The document production had revealed a web of coordination more extensive than even Eleanor had initially suspected. But the most significant breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. 3 days earlier, Rebecca Sanderson, the deputy mayor who had attempted to buy Eleanor's silence, had abruptly requested a private meeting with state prosecutors. Facing potential indictment for her role in the scheme, she had decided to save herself by providing evidence against others. Eleanor's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Michael Chen with news from the Attorney General's office. They've offered plea deals to 3 mid-level city officials in exchange for testimony against the mayor and Alexander Patterson, he reported. The case is moving up the ladder exactly as we predicted. And the civil claims for the former residents? Eleanor asked, focused as always on justice for those who had been victimized. The AG has proposed a global settlement framework. Meridian would establish a compensation fund for all elderly homeowners who sold under duress, with payments representing the difference between sale price and true market value, plus punitive damages. Eleanor nodded with satisfaction. Financial compensation couldn't erase the emotional trauma of being forced from cherished homes, but it represented tangible acknowledgement of the wrong done to these elderly citizens. There's something else, Michael continued. The mayor is holding a press conference at noon. Rumors suggest he's planning to announce a new Elderly Housing Protection Act as damage control. Eleanor couldn't help but laugh at the transparent attempt to rewrite the narrative. Fascinating how our conspiracy theories have become so legitimate that they're now driving policy changes. After ending the call, Eleanor turned to find Caroline watching her with a curious expression. Eleanor opened the door but remained behind the security chain. It's rather late for official business, Ms. Sanderson. The deputy mayor's normally composed face showed strain. Professor Winters, this situation has escalated unnecessarily. I'm here unofficially to see if we might find a resolution that serves everyone's interests. By everyone's interests, you mean Meridian's interests and your own, Eleanor replied calmly. Please make your offer so I can decline it and get some sleep. Rebecca's professional smile tightened. The mayor is prepared to resolve all outstanding code violations on your property immediately. Meridian will offer full market value plus 20% for your home. In exchange, you would withdraw your complaint and sign a confidentiality agreement regarding your theories about coordination. Eleanor studied the younger woman thoughtfully. That's actually a more generous offer than I expected. It suggests you're quite concerned about what discovery might reveal. It's simply good governance to resolve disputes efficiently, Rebecca countered smoothly. And what about the other elderly residents who were defrauded? Does your good governance extend to them? Rebecca's expression hardened. Professor, you've had a distinguished career. Don't tarnish it by pursuing conspiracy theories that you can't possibly prove. Accept this generous offer and enjoy your retirement in comfort. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, the same dismissive attitude Eleanor had encountered throughout this ordeal. Miss Sanderson, let me be clear, Eleanor replied, her voice taking on the edge that had intimidated generations of unprepared law students. I have already proven enough to secure a temporary injunction from a respected judge. Discovery will reveal much more. If your visit was intended to intimidate me, you failed. If it was meant to tempt me with personal gain at others' expense, you've misjudged my character. After closing the door on the deputy mayor's sputtering response, Eleanor leaned against it briefly, feeling the weight of the day's events. The offer itself confirmed her suspicions. They were deeply worried about what documentary evidence might emerge during discovery. The next morning brought Caroline's arrival and with it, reinforcement Eleanor hadn't realized she needed. Seeing her daughter's shock at the transformed dining room, now covered with legal documents, timeline charts, and witness statements, made Eleanor recognize how all-consuming the case had become. "Mom, this is incredible," Caroline said, taking in the comprehensive investigation. "When did you sleep?" "Sleep is overrated when you're 71, Eleanor replied with a small smile. "The brain requires less rest when you've already lived most of your life." Caroline embraced her mother, the gesture carrying unspoken apology for her initial doubts. "I'm still processing how wrong I was. When you first talked about this conspiracy, I thought. You thought age had affected my judgment," Eleanor finished gently. "It's a common assumption. The real question is whether you've learned from the mistake." Their conversation was interrupted by Michael's arrival with news from the courthouse. Judge Harrington had appointed a special master to oversee document production after city attorneys claimed executive privilege for communications between officials. "It's actually good news," Michael explained. "The special master is Judge Rivera, retired from the federal bench and known for his intolerance of stonewalling. He'll review the documents they're trying to withhold and make independent determinations about privilege claims." Eleanor nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect. Rivera taught a seminar with me years ago on public corruption cases. He understands exactly how officials try to hide evidence." The day unfolded with methodical purpose as Caroline applied her organizational skills to Eleanor's evidence collection. By late afternoon, they had created a comprehensive database linking each elderly homeowner's experience to specific officials and Meridian representatives. "The pattern is even clearer when visualized this way," Caroline observed, studying their timeline chart. "Each case follows an almost identical sequence, just separated by a few weeks to avoid obvious connection." Eleanor was about to respond when her phone rang with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was hesitant, nervous. "Professor Winters? My name is Jasmine Torres. I worked in the city's building inspection office. I think I have information you should know." An hour later, Jasmine sat in Eleanor's living room, hands clutching a manila envelope, eyes constantly darting toward the windows. In her early 30s and dressed in the practical attire of a municipal employee, she radiated the tension of someone taking an enormous professional risk. "I processed the paperwork for building code inspections," she explained. "About 18 months ago, we received a new protocol for priority enforcement zones, neighborhoods slated for special attention. Beacon Hill was designated Priority 1. She opened the envelope, removing a memo on city letterhead. This document established the protocol. It instructed inspectors to apply enhanced scrutiny to properties owned by residents over 65 in designated zones. Eleanor examined the memo, noting the signature of the building commissioner. This explicitly targeted elderly homeowners. Jasmine nodded. "There's more. For these properties, inspectors were given a different checklist. One with more stringent requirements than standard inspections. And they were instructed to document everything with photos, even minor issues that would normally be addressed with verbal warnings." "Who created these special checklists?" Michael asked. "That's what finally made me come forward," Jasmine replied, removing another document from her envelope. "I found this email accidentally while archiving files. It's from Alexander Patterson at Meridian, sending the suggested inspection criteria to Commissioner Walters." Eleanor accepted the email printout with steady hands that belied her internal excitement. This was the smoking gun, direct evidence of Meridian dictating how city inspectors should target elderly homeowners. "Jasmine, we'll need you to testify about these documents," Eleanor said gently. The younger woman paled. "I'll lose my job. Maybe face criminal charges for taking internal documents." "You're a whistleblower exposing government corruption," Michael interjected. "There are legal protections. My firm can represent you at no cost." After Jasmine left with Michael's assurances of legal protection, Eleanor and Caroline carefully documented and secured the new evidence. "This changes everything," Caroline observed. "They can't claim coincidence anymore." "It confirms what I suspected from the beginning," Eleanor replied. "This was deliberate, systematic exploitation of elderly residents, executed through abuse of government authority." That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected call from Judge Harrington's clerk, requesting her presence at an emergency hearing the following morning. Meridian's attorneys had filed a motion to dismiss based on new evidence they claimed discredited her entire case. "They're getting desperate," Eleanor told Caroline after hanging up. "This is likely a delay tactic, but we need to prepare for all possibilities." Through the night, mother and daughter worked side by side, reviewing their evidence and strengthening their arguments. The contrast with her earlier isolation was striking. Having Caroline's support provided not just practical assistance but emotional reinforcement as well. In the morning, Eleanor dressed with particular care, selecting her most authoritative Courtroom attire, a charcoal suit with subtle pinstripes that Thomas had always said made her look judicial. Caroline helped arrange her silver hair in its characteristic neat bun, both women understanding the importance of presentation. In a system where appearances often influenced perceptions of competence. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. News of the emergency hearing had drawn media attention, and reporters filled the gallery alongside concerned community members. Meridian's legal team had expanded to 7 attorneys, their table covered with tablets and legal briefs. Judge Harrington entered and immediately addressed Meridian's lead counsel. Mr. Blackwell, you've requested this emergency hearing based on what you describe as game-changing evidence. Please present it expeditiously. Blackwell rose with the confident air of someone holding a winning hand. Your Honor, we've discovered evidence that Professor Winters' complaint is motivated not by genuine concern for elderly homeowners, but by personal financial interest. He dramatically produced several documents. These records show that Professor Winters established a non-profit organization called Beacon Hill Preservation Trust 3 years ago. The trust's bylaws specifically mention acquiring and maintaining historic properties in the neighborhood. Eleanor felt Caroline stiffen beside her, but maintained her own composed expression. Furthermore, Blackwell continued, Professor Winters approached 3 homeowners who later sold to Meridian with offers from her trust at below market rates. When they declined, she began building this so-called case against our client. Judge Harrington turned to Eleanor. Professor Winters, would you care to respond to these allegations? Eleanor rose slowly, surveying the courtroom before speaking. Your Honor. Patterson watching from his car across the street, his expression a mixture of shock and calculation. Their eyes met briefly, and Eleanor nodded slightly, acknowledgement of the first battle in what would likely be a prolonged war. That evening, Eleanor sat in her living room surrounded by the home she had fought to protect. The temporary injunction was just the beginning. Discovery would likely reveal even more extensive corruption than she had already documented. The case could potentially expand to include other neighborhoods, other developers, other officials. Her phone rang, Caroline again, this time with a completely different tone. Mom, I owe you an apology, she began without preamble. I should have believed you. I should have trusted your judgment instead of assuming you were confused. It's a common assumption, Eleanor replied, feeling the weight of the day's events in her tired bones. People hear my age and see my white hair. And they draw conclusions about my capabilities. Will you forgive me? Of course, Eleanor said softly. But remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to dismiss someone because they're older. Age brings experience, perspective, and sometimes a certain clarity that youth doesn't possess. After hanging up, Eleanor gazed at the photograph of Thomas on the mantel. They said I was too old to understand what they were doing, she told his smiling image. So I used their underestimation to build a case they never saw coming. The evening news featured her story prominently, retired law professor exposes alleged corruption targeting elderly homeowners. The reporters described her as brilliantly strategic and formidable, adjectives rarely applied to 71-year-old women in public discourse. As Eleanor prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's victory with satisfaction. The battle was far from over, but she had accomplished something significant, not just for herself, but for every elderly person dismissed as confused, incompetent, or past their prime. They had thought her age made her vulnerable. Instead, it had made her unstoppable. The decades of experience they dismissed as irrelevant had provided exactly the tools she needed to recognize, document, and challenge their scheme. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, depositions to prepare for, discovery documents to review, pressure tactics from Meridian's allies to anticipate. But tonight, Eleanor Winters, 71 years old and underestimated for the last time, allowed herself to savor the sweet taste of vindication. Her age hadn't been a liability after all. It had been her secret weapon. Eleanor Winters awoke before dawn, her mind already cataloging the day's critical tasks. The temporary injunction, granted by Judge Harrington, had been only the opening salvo in what promised to be a complex legal battle. Through her bedroom window, she could see the first hints of sunrise illuminating the Boston skyline, the same view that had greeted her for 30 years, now threatened by corporate greed and municipal corruption. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Holloway, saw you on the news. You were magnificent. What can we do to help? Eleanor smiled. The community was rallying around her cause, former neighbors finding courage in her stand against Meridian development. She texted back, gather everyone who sold to Meridian. Meeting at my house, 10 a.m. Bring all paperwork. As she prepared her morning tea, Eleanor reviewed her strategy. Judge Harrington's discovery order would force Meridian and city officials to produce internal communications, but experience told her they would find ways to delay and obstruct. She needed to build additional pressure from multiple directions. The doorbell rang precisely at 8 a.m. Eleanor opened it to find Michael Chen, her former student who had initially been skeptical of her case. "Professor Winters," he said, looking both impressed and slightly embarrassed, "I'd like to offer my firm's services as co-counsel. What you've accomplished is remarkable, but the discovery process will be intensive." Eleanor regarded him with the measured gaze that had intimidated generations of law students. "Yesterday you suggested I was too outdated to navigate modern litigation. Today you're volunteering to help. What changed, Michael?" He had the grace to look chastened. "I watched the hearing video. Your command of the courtroom was masterful. I was wrong to doubt you based on..." He hesitated. "Based on my age," Eleanor finished for him. "It's a common mistake. Please come in." In her dining room, now serving as a legal war room with documents organized in precise stacks across the mahogany table, Eleanor outlined her approach while Michael took notes. "Meridian and the city will attempt 3 strategies," she explained. "First, delay through procedural objections. Second, document obstruction by claiming privilege or losing critical communications. Third, intimidation of witnesses, particularly elderly former residents who may feel vulnerable." Michael nodded, increasingly impressed by her strategic clarity. "How do you want to counter?" "We apply pressure from multiple angles simultaneously," Eleanor replied. "Litigation is our primary front, but we'll also pursue state ethics complaints against the officials involved, contact the Attorney General's Public Corruption Unit, and generate public attention through carefully coordinated media strategy." At 10 a.m., Eleanor's living room filled with elderly former neighbors, many meeting for the first time since being forced from their homes. The atmosphere initially held the subdued quality of a support group, people united by shared trauma and lingering shame at having been manipulated. Eleanor stood before them, her posture still carrying the authority of decades at the lectern. "What happened to each of you wasn't your fault," she began. "You were targeted specifically because of your age. Meridian and corrupt city officials weaponized ageist assumptions against you, counting on stereotypes about elderly confusion and incompetence to execute their scheme." Margaret Holloway, perched on the edge of an armchair, nodded vigorously. "They made me feel like I was losing my mind. When I questioned the sudden tax increase, the assessor spoke to me like I was a child who couldn't understand basic math." "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "This wasn't just about acquiring properties cheaply. It was systematic elder abuse, executed through official channels." For the next 2 hours, Eleanor and Michael documented each former resident's experience, creating a timeline that demonstrated the coordinated nature of the scheme. The pattern was undeniable: each elderly homeowner had experienced nearly identical sequences of official harassment followed by opportunistic purchase offers. "What can we actually accomplish at this point?" asked Richard Chambers, a former dentist who'd sold his home the previous year. "Our properties are gone. Meridian has already demolished some for new construction." Eleanor's expression remained determined. 3 things. First, financial compensation for the difference between what you received and fair market value. Second, accountability for those who exploited you. And third, legal precedent to protect other elderly homeowners from similar schemes. As her former neighbors departed with renewed purpose, Eleanor noticed a sleek black sedan parked across the street. 2 men in suits watched her house with undisguised interest. "Meridian sent surveillance," she commented to Michael. "Good. That means they're worried." Michael followed her gaze. "Should we be concerned about your safety?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "They won't risk anything too obvious now that there's public attention. But I've already installed security cameras. And changed my locks." She didn't mention the baseball bat now kept beside her bed, a concession to practical reality that Thomas would have approved. By afternoon, Eleanor's strategy was bearing fruit. The Boston Globe ran a front-page investigation, expanding on her allegations. 3 additional elderly homeowners from neighboring communities had come forward with similar stories involving Meridian. The state attorney general's office announced a preliminary inquiry into possible corruption. Most significantly, Judge Harrington had denied Meridian's motion to delay discovery, ordering immediate production of all communications between the company and named city officials. Eleanor was reviewing deposition strategies when her phone rang. Caroline again, this time with unexpected news. "Mom, I've taken 2 weeks of leave from work. I'm flying in tomorrow morning." "That's not necessary," Eleanor protested, though secretly pleased. "I'm managing fine." "This isn't about you needing help," Caroline replied. "It's about me wanting to witness my mother make legal history. Plus, I'm bringing documentation skills from my hospital administration work that might be useful for organizing evidence." After hanging up, Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions. Caroline's support was welcome, but a lifetime of independence made accepting help difficult. Still, the practical benefits of having trusted family assistance outweighed her pride. The evening news brought further developments. The city's building commissioner had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. An emergency city council meeting had been called to discuss the allegations. Meridian's stock price had dropped 12% as investors reacted to potential legal liability. As Eleanor prepared for bed, her doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the security camera she'd installed, she recognized Rebecca Sanderson, the city's deputy mayor and close ally of Alexander Patterson. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "I was just thinking about how different you seem now compared to a month ago," Caroline replied. "There's a vibrancy to you that I haven't seen since before Dad died." Eleanor considered this observation. The exhausting legal battle had paradoxically energized rather than depleted her. After years of retirement, of being increasingly marginalized by a society that equated age with irrelevance, she had rediscovered her purpose. "Purpose is rejuvenating," she said finally. "Being underestimated and dismissed for years took a toll I didn't fully recognize until I started fighting back." The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Through the security camera, Eleanor recognized Margaret Holloway accompanied by several other former neighbors. When she opened the door, Margaret immediately embraced her. "We've been meeting as a group," she explained. "Not just about the case, but about what comes next." Eleanor ushered them into her living room, noting how different they seemed from their first gathering. The shame and defeat that had initially marked their expressions had been replaced by determination and solidarity. These weren't victims anymore, they were advocates. Richard Chambers, the former dentist, spread a folder of documents across Eleanor's coffee table. "We've incorporated as a nonprofit called Silver Advocates for Housing Justice. Our mission is to identify and challenge similar schemes targeting elderly homeowners nationwide." Eleanor examined their materials with growing admiration. The organization's structure was professional, its mission clearly defined, its strategies thoughtfully developed. These were people in their 70s and 80s whom society routinely dismissed as irrelevant, yet they had created something remarkable from the ashes of their collective trauma. "We want you on our advisory board," Margaret said. "Your legal expertise would be invaluable, but more importantly, you showed us that age can be a source of power rather than vulnerability." The invitation touched Eleanor deeply. Throughout her career, she had been an advocate for others, using her legal knowledge to fight systemic injustice. But this was different, a movement created by and for elderly citizens who refused to be silenced or manipulated. "I'd be honored," she replied sincerely. "But I'm curious, what specific initiatives are you planning?" Irene Chambers, Richard's wife, eagerly outlined their initial projects: educational workshops to help elderly homeowners recognize predatory tactics, a legal clinic staffed by volunteer attorneys specializing in elder law, and a legislative advocacy arm focused on strengthening protections against age-based housing discrimination. "We're also developing a rapid response network," she explained. "When elderly residents report suspicious patterns of code enforcement or tax reassessment, we'll document the cases and connect them with appropriate resources before they're pressured into selling." Eleanor listened with growing admiration. These people had transformed their individual experiences of victimization into collective action that would protect countless others. Their age, the very characteristic that Meridian and city officials had weaponized against them, had become the foundation of their advocacy. "What you're creating is revolutionary," she told them. "Not just because of what it will accomplish, but because it fundamentally challenges how society views elderly citizens." The mayor's noon press conference unfolded exactly as Eleanor had predicted. Standing before City Hall with carefully arranged elderly constituents as backdrop, he announced the Boston Elder Housing Protection Initiative, a comprehensive program allegedly designed to help seniors remain in their homes through tax relief, repair assistance, and protection from predatory development practices. Eleanor, Caroline, and her former neighbors watched the performance on television with a mixture of amusement and indignation. "He's literally describing the very practices his administration helped Meridian execute," Richard observed incredulously. "Just framing them as problems he's boldly addressing." "It's actually perfect," Eleanor replied with unexpected satisfaction. "He's publicly committing to specific protections that can be legally enforced going forward." His desperate attempt at image rehabilitation will create tools we can use to hold future administrations accountable. Margaret laughed. "You really do play chess while they're playing checkers, don't you?" Later that afternoon, as her neighbors departed to continue their organizing work, Eleanor received another unexpected visitor. Through the security camera, She recognized Alexander Patterson himself standing on her porch, alone and without his usual corporate polish. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the door but remained behind the security chain. "Mr. Patterson. This is unexpected." The developer's normally confident demeanor had eroded, revealing the strain of weeks under increasing legal and public pressure. His company's stock had plummeted, investors were fleeing, and indictment seemed increasingly likely. "Professor Winters," he began, voice carefully modulated, "I've come to propose a resolution that might benefit everyone involved." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but said nothing, forcing him to continue without encouragement. "Meridian is prepared to establish a substantial restitution fund for affected homeowners, $30 million, to be distributed based on independent appraisals of true market value at time of sale, plus 20% for emotional damages." The figure was significant, far more than their initial legal strategy had targeted, suggesting just how desperate Patterson had become. "In addition," he continued, "we would implement an elderly homeowner protection policy for all future developments, including right of first refusal for seniors to purchase units in new buildings at below market rates." Eleanor studied him with the analytical gaze that had intimidated countless opposing counsel over decades. "And in exchange for this generosity, Meridian would admit no wrongdoing, face no criminal charges, and continue operations with minimal disruption." Patterson had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "The legal framework would involve a consent decree without admission of liability, yes." "Mr. Patterson," Eleanor replied evenly, "you seem to be operating under several misconceptions. First, that this case is primarily about money rather than accountability. Second, that I personally control the multiple investigations now underway. And third, that I would betray the public interest for any amount of financial settlement." She opened the door fully, confidence allowing her to drop the security chain barrier. "Your offer is inadequate not just in amount but in concept. The elderly residents you exploited deserve both compensation and justice, the public acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong and those responsible are being held accountable." Patterson's facade of reasonable negotiation cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake. My attorneys believe we can eventually overcome these allegations. This settlement opportunity won't remain available indefinitely." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Mr. Patterson, I taught negotiation strategy at Boston College Law School for 30 years. This unannounced visit, your body language, and the specific terms you've offered all reveal your actual position quite clearly. Meridian is in serious trouble, your legal team is pessimistic about your chances, and you're desperate to resolve this before criminal indictments are issued." The flash of anger in his eyes confirmed her assessment. "I'll consider your offer a starting point for discussion," she continued calmly. "I'll present it to the affected homeowners and our legal team. But I should warn you, any acceptable resolution will require public accountability, not just financial compensation." After Patterson departed, Caroline emerged from the kitchen where she'd been listening. "That was masterful. You completely controlled that interaction." Eleanor shrugged. "Experience has value, despite what our youth-obsessed culture suggests. I've negotiated with men like Alexander Patterson for decades, men who believe their wealth and position place them above accountability." She settled into her armchair, feeling the familiar ache in her joints that accompanied extended confrontation. "What's interesting is how his perspective has shifted. A month ago, he saw me as a confused elderly woman who could be easily dismissed. Today, he came to my door seeking resolution on terms he hoped I would find attractive." "Because you've demonstrated power," Caroline observed. "And power is the only language he truly understands." The following morning brought news that shifted the case dramatically. The Boston Globe reported that federal prosecutors had joined the investigation, focusing on potential violations of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. The article detailed how the scheme to target elderly homeowners potentially constituted a pattern of related criminal activities conducted through an enterprise, the legal definition of racketeering. "Federal involvement changes everything," Michael explained during their strategy call. "RICO charges carry severe penalties, including asset forfeiture. Meridian executives are facing not just reputation damage but potentially significant prison sentences." Eleanor understood the implications immediately. Patterson's settlement offer yesterday makes more sense now. He must have known this was coming. The case's expansion to federal court would normally have diminished Eleanor's direct involvement, as specialized prosecutors took the lead on RICO investigations. Eleanor opened the envelope to find an offer for 80% of her home's market value, a significant increase from previous offers, but still well below what the property was worth. "Mr. Patterson also wanted me to mention that the building Inspection deadline is approaching, the young man added with practiced casualness. He understands the repairs would be quite extensive and difficult for someone in your situation. My situation? Eleanor asked mildly. Well, you know, he gestured vaguely, living alone at your age, managing such a large property. Eleanor smiled. Please tell Mr. Patterson I appreciate his concern for my situation. I'll consider his offer alongside my other options. After closing the door, Eleanor added the new offer to her evidence file. The timing confirmed her suspicions. Someone at City Hall had informed Meridian about her records requests. They were worried enough to increase their offer, but still confident in their ability to pressure her. That evening, she received another call from Caroline, who sounded more concerned than ever. Mom, I spoke with Dr. Levine today, she began. Hesitantly. He thinks it might be good for you to come stay with us in Seattle for a while. Just until the situation with your house is resolved. Eleanor recognized the subtext immediately. Did you ask him to evaluate my mental competence without examining me? Mom, that's not fair. I'm worried about you. You're alone in that big house, fighting imaginary conspiracies instead of dealing with real problems. They're not imaginary, Caroline. And I'm not leaving my home because someone thinks I'm too old to defend myself. After hanging up, Eleanor faced the painful realization that even her daughter's concern had become another form of the same dismissal she was fighting. Everyone assumed her age made her incapable of understanding what was happening to her and her community. The next morning, Eleanor filed her complaint with the Suffolk County Superior Court. She paid the filing fee in cash and requested immediate consideration of the injunction due to ongoing harm to elderly residents. By noon, her complaint had been assigned to Judge Robert Harrington, a respected jurist known for his no-nonsense approach to complex cases. By 3 p.m., her phone was ringing constantly. First Michael Chen, then 2 other former students, all expressing shock at the comprehensive legal action she'd filed without their assistance. Local news reporters called next, having been alerted to the bombshell allegations against Meridian and city officials. At 4 p.m., a visibly agitated Alexander Patterson appeared on her doorstep without his usual corporate polish. Professor Winters. He began, attempting to maintain his professional demeanor, I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. If you had concerns about our offers or the city's processes, you could have come directly to me. Eleanor regarded him calmly. Mr. Patterson, there's no misunderstanding. I've documented a pattern of targeting elderly homeowners through coordinated actions between your company and corrupt city officials. That's not a misunderstanding, it's a crime. Patterson's facade cracked slightly. These are serious allegations that could damage reputations unnecessarily. I'm prepared to offer you full market value for your property today if you'll withdraw that complaint. This isn't about my property anymore, Eleanor replied. This is about justice for everyone you've exploited. After Patterson left, Eleanor received notice that Judge Harrington had granted her request for an emergency hearing the following morning regarding the requested injunction. He had also issued an order requiring preservation of all relevant documents and communications. That night, Eleanor prepared her argument while fielding calls from increasingly supportive former neighbors. News of her legal action had spread quickly through the community, and many who had sold to Meridian were now willing to testify about their experiences. Caroline called just before midnight, her tone transformed from concern to cautious admiration. Mom, your case is all over. The Seattle News. They're calling you the professor who fought back. Is this really as big as they're saying? It's exactly as big as I've been telling you it is, Eleanor replied, allowing herself a small smile of vindication. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage of all. The next morning, Eleanor dressed in her finest courtroom attire, a well-tailored navy suit, modest pearl necklace, and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades in legal proceedings. She arrived at the courthouse to find a small crowd of supporters, former neighbors, community activists, and several of her former students who had finally recognized the legitimacy of her claims. Inside the courtroom, Meridian's legal team occupied one table, 5 attorneys in expensive suits, armed with tablets and legal assistants. At the city's table sat the municipal attorney alongside outside counsel hastily retained to handle the explosive allegations. Their expressions conveyed a mixture of concern and lingering dismissiveness as Eleanor made her way to the plaintiff's table alone, carrying only her worn leather briefcase. When Judge Harrington entered, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Known for his sharp intellect and impatience with legal games, he studied the assembled attorneys before fixing his gaze on Eleanor. Professor Winters, he began, I've reviewed your complaint and find the allegations both serious and substantiated by your initial evidence. However, I note you're representing yourself in an extraordinarily complex case. Are you certain that's wise? Eleanor rose, standing straight despite the arthritis that sometimes troubled her back. Your Honor, I taught constitutional law and civil procedure at Boston College Law School for 43 years. While I appreciate your concern, I believe I'm qualified to present this case, at least at the injunction phase. A small smile crossed the judge's face. Indeed. I should disclose that I attended your lecture series on property rights and municipal authority in 1998. It was illuminating then, and appears relevant now. Please proceed with your argument for injunctive relief. For the next hour, Eleanor presented her case with the precision and clarity that had made her a legendary professor. She methodically outlined the pattern of harassment against elderly homeowners, the coordination between Meridian and city officials, and the specific harms that would continue without court intervention. She presented affidavits, property records, tax documents, and photographs documenting meetings between the defendants. Throughout her presentation, she noticed the shift in expression among the defense attorneys, from initial dismissiveness to growing concern as they realized they were facing not a confused elderly woman, but a formidable legal mind with meticulously documented evidence of wrongdoing. When Meridian's lead counsel rose to respond, his previously prepared arguments about an elderly woman's misunderstandings and confusion sounded hollow against Eleanor's comprehensive presentation. Your Honor, he attempted, while we respect Professor Winters' distinguished career, the allegations represent a fundamental misinterpretation of standard business and municipal practices. There is no conspiracy, merely coincidental timing in property assessments and business opportunities. Judge Harrington's skeptical expression spoke volumes. Counselor, are you suggesting that 27 elderly homeowners coincidentally experienced identical sequences of reassessment, code violations, and below-market offers? That officials with direct personal connections to Meridian coincidentally took actions benefiting the company? The city's attorney tried a different approach. Your Honor, these are serious allegations against public officials that should be investigated through proper administrative channels before requiring judicial intervention. The proper administrative channels, Eleanor interjected, are overseen by the very officials named in this complaint. The fox cannot be trusted to investigate the henhouse. By the end of the 3-hour hearing, the mood in the courtroom had transformed. Judge Harrington granted Eleanor's request for a temporary injunction preventing any further enforcement actions against elderly homeowners in the neighborhood and ordered expedited discovery of communications between Meridian and city officials. Most significantly, he appointed a special master to oversee the discovery process, ensuring that documents couldn't be conveniently lost or destroyed. As Eleanor gathered her materials, Meridian's legal team huddled in urgent conversation. Their client's strategy had been built on the assumption that elderly targets would be too intimidated, confused, or isolated to fight back effectively. They had never anticipated facing someone who could use their own ageist assumptions against them. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Eleanor as she descended the steps. Professor Winters, did you anticipate this level of success when you filed your complaint? One journalist asked. Eleanor smiled. I anticipated that they would underestimate me because of my age. That was their first mistake. What's your response to Meridian's statement that you've misinterpreted normal business practices? Another reporter called out. I've been interpreting the law longer than most of their attorneys have been alive, Eleanor replied. I didn't misinterpret anything. They simply assumed I wouldn't understand what they were doing. As she made her way through the crowd, Eleanor spotted Alexander. Eleanor could practically hear her daughter's unspoken thought, Mom's becoming paranoid in her old age. Have you talked to Dr. Levine about this? Caroline finally asked, referencing Eleanor's physician. Sometimes stress can make us see connections that aren't really there. The dismissal stung worse than any building inspector's report. I've been connecting dots my entire career, Caroline. My age hasn't diminished my analytical abilities. After promising to get some rest, Eleanor ended the call, feeling the familiar weight of being underestimated settle onto her shoulders. Even her own daughter assumed that her concerns stemmed from confusion rather than legitimate observation. She returned to her research with renewed determination, creating a detailed spreadsheet of properties, dates, officials involved, and outcomes. By 2 a.m., she had compiled enough evidence to suggest a pattern that couldn't be coincidental. But she needed more: internal communications, evidence of coordination, proof of the relationships between Meridian and city officials. The next morning, Eleanor dressed with particular care, a tailored charcoal suit she'd worn for court appearances. Pearl earrings Thomas had given her on their 30th anniversary, hair arranged in her characteristic neat bun. If she was going to be judged by her appearance, she would present herself as the distinguished professional she was, not the confused elderly woman they expected. Her first stop was the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds, where a young clerk looked up from his phone with poorly disguised impatience as she approached. "I need to review all property transfers in Beacon Hill involving Meridian Development for the past 2 years, Eleanor stated, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that had commanded lecture halls for decades. "That's a lot of records, ma'am," the clerk replied, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it clear he saw her as an inconvenience. "Might take several days to compile. Maybe you'd prefer to submit a written request?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "I'm quite familiar with public records law, young man. Massachusetts General Laws Chapter 66, Section 10 requires you to provide public records promptly. I'll wait while you gather them." The clerk's expression shifted slightly as he realized she wasn't a typical senior citizen confused by bureaucracy. Within an hour, Eleanor was seated at a research table with the requested records, methodically documenting each transaction in her notebook. Her next stop was City Hall, where she filed formal public records requests for all communications between Meridian Development and various city departments. The clerk at the Public Information Office frowned at the extensive nature of her request. "This is quite broad, Ms. Winters. It might be helpful if you could narrow your focus." "I understand. It's extensive," Eleanor replied. "But I believe it's necessary to establish the pattern of coordination between Meridian and city officials in targeting elderly homeowners for property acquisition." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious allegation." "Yes," Eleanor agreed calmly. "And one I intend to substantiate through these records." As she left City Hall, Eleanor noticed a familiar figure across the street, Alexander Patterson himself, Meridian's CEO, entering an expensive steakhouse alongside the city's building commissioner. She quickly retrieved her phone and snapped several photos of the two men shaking hands and laughing together before disappearing inside. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor established a routine. Mornings were spent at various city offices reviewing public records. Afternoons were dedicated to interviewing former neighbors who had sold to Meridian. Evenings were spent organizing her findings and researching relevant legal precedents. Most of her former neighbors were reluctant to speak at first, embarrassed by what they now recognized as manipulation. But Eleanor's gentle, persistent questioning gradually revealed similar stories: sudden tax increases, questionable code violations, implicit threats about property condemnation, and finally, relief at accepting Meridian's lowball offers to escape the mounting pressure. "They made me feel incompetent," Margaret Holloway confessed during their conversation at a local coffee shop. "Like I was too old and confused to understand modern building codes or property values. By the time I sold, I was actually grateful to them for taking the problem off my hands." "They counted on that feeling," Eleanor replied, patting Margaret's hand. "They weaponized your age against you." By the 3rd week, Eleanor had compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting what appeared to be a systematic conspiracy between Meridian Development and key city officials to pressure elderly homeowners into selling valuable properties at below-market rates. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. Her daughter called daily now, increasingly concerned about Eleanor's obsession. "Mom, this isn't healthy," Caroline insisted during their latest conversation. "You're spending all your time on this conspiracy theory instead of addressing the actual problems with your house." "It's not a theory when there's evidence," Eleanor replied, struggling to keep frustration from her voice. "I've documented 27 cases following the same pattern. I've photographed Meridian executives meeting privately with city officials, who later took action against specific properties. This is happening, Caroline. Even if it is, what can you possibly do about it? You're one person up against a powerful company and city government." The question hit at Eleanor's deepest fear, that despite all her evidence, her age would render her powerless against institutional corruption. But she had one advantage they didn't expect: they believed their own narrative about elderly confusion and incompetence. "I'm going to use their assumptions against them," she told Caroline. "They think I'm just a confused old lady who doesn't understand what's happening. That's their weakness, not mine." After hanging up, Eleanor turned to the legal strategy she'd been developing. Massachusetts had strong elder protection laws, anti-corruption statutes, and specific prohibitions against official misconduct. Additionally, the pattern of targeting elderly homeowners potentially violated fair housing laws and civil rights protections. She needed to file not just a complaint, but a comprehensive legal action that would force discovery of internal communications and prevent the destruction of evidence. And she needed to ensure it received proper attention rather than being dismissed as an elderly person's confusion. Eleanor contacted 3 former students who had become prominent attorneys, explaining her findings and asking for their perspectives. All 3 expressed concern about the patterns she'd documented, but also hesitation about directly challenging both a powerful developer and city government. This would be an uphill battle even for a major law firm, explained Michael Chen, now a partner at a prestigious Boston firm. The resources required would be substantial, and proving coordination rather than coincidence would be challenging. What if I handle the initial filing myself? Eleanor asked. I may be retired, but I haven't forgotten how to prepare a legal brief. Michael's silence spoke volumes about his concerns regarding her age and perceived capabilities. Professor Winters, he finally said, reverting to her formal title, with all respect for your distinguished career, litigation has changed significantly in recent years. The electronic filing systems alone can be challenging for practitioners who haven't kept current. Eleanor recognized the patronizing tone, the same one she'd heard from the tax assessor's office, the building inspector, and now her former student. They all assumed her age equated to incompetence. Thank you for your insights, Michael, she said pleasantly. I'll take them under advisement. After the call, Eleanor sat at her dining room table surrounded by her evidence and legal research. The dismissive attitudes were infuriating, but they also presented an opportunity. If everyone, from Meridian's executives to city officials to even her former students, underestimated her because of her age, she could use that blind spot to her advantage. She wouldn't just file a complaint. She would construct a legal trap so comprehensive and meticulously documented that by the time they recognized the threat, it would be too late to cover their tracks. Eleanor opened her laptop and began drafting what would become her masterpiece, a 60-page legal complaint. Documenting the systematic targeting of elderly homeowners, complete with evidence of coordination between Meridian Development and city officials. She cited relevant statutes, included affidavits from former neighbors, and attached public records demonstrating the pattern of harassment and coercion. The complaint named not just Meridian Development but specific city officials, including the mayor, building commissioner, and head of tax assessment. It alleged civil rights violations, elder abuse, official misconduct, conspiracy, and racketeering. Most importantly, it requested an immediate injunction preventing any further action against elderly-owned properties and requiring preservation of all communications between the defendants. 3 days later, her doorbell rang. Standing on her porch was a young man in an expensive suit, holding an envelope. Eleanor Winters? He asked. Yes, she replied, already suspecting his purpose. I'm representing Meridian Development. I've been authorized to present you with a new offer for your property. He handed her the envelope. Mr. Patterson believes this will resolve any concerns you might have about fair value. But her comprehensive documentation and legal expertise had made her an invaluable resource to investigators. The U.S. Attorney's Office had requested her assistance as a consulting expert, recognizing that her age and experience provided unique insight into how the scheme had specifically targeted vulnerable elderly residents. That afternoon, Eleanor met with federal prosecutors at their Boston offices. The contrast between their initial approach and that of local officials months earlier couldn't have been more striking. Where city attorneys had patronized and dismissed her, these federal lawyers treated her with deferential respect, eagerly seeking her analysis of the evidence. Professor Winters, the lead prosecutor, began, "Your work documenting this conspiracy has been extraordinary. We've built major RICO cases with far less comprehensive evidence than what you've compiled." For 3 hours, Eleanor walked them through her findings, highlighting connections between seemingly disparate events, identifying key documents that revealed coordination, and explaining how ageist assumptions had been weaponized against elderly homeowners. The genius of their scheme, she explained, was how it exploited societal biases about elderly cognitive capacity. When seniors questioned sudden tax increases or code violations, officials responded with patronizing dismissal, creating self-doubt. That made victims more vulnerable to Meridian's lowball offers. The U.S. attorney nodded thoughtfully. You've identified not just the mechanics of the conspiracy but its psychological foundation. That's incredibly valuable for building our case. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor felt a profound sense of validation. After months of being underestimated because of her age, she was now valued precisely because of the perspective and expertise that decades of experience had provided. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed. Within days, grand jury subpoenas were issued to Meridian executives and city officials. Alexander Patterson's home and office were searched pursuant to federal warrants. The mayor announced he would not seek re-election, a transparent attempt to distance himself from the growing scandal. Most significantly for Eleanor, Judge Harrington certified the civil case as a class action, allowing her to represent all elderly homeowners who had sold to Meridian under similar circumstances. This judicial recognition transformed what had begun as her personal stand against corruption into a comprehensive legal remedy for dozens of victims. As these developments unfolded, Eleanor found herself increasingly in demand as a speaker and advocate. Elder rights organizations, law schools, and community groups requested her presence at events focusing on housing justice and age discrimination. Media outlets sought her perspective not just on the Meridian case but on broader issues affecting elderly Americans. "You've become the face of resistance to elder exploitation," Caroline observed as they reviewed the growing stack of invitations. "People see in you something they desperately need, proof that age can be a source of power rather than vulnerability." Eleanor considered this with mixed emotions. The public attention was gratifying but exhausting, consuming energy she needed for the ongoing legal battle. Yet she recognized the importance of visibility in changing cultural narratives about aging. "I'll accept the law school invitations," she decided. "Teaching future attorneys to recognize and challenge age-based discrimination seems most aligned with my expertise." That evening, as Eleanor prepared for her first major public address, a keynote speech at Harvard Law School on age discrimination and housing justice, she received an unexpected call from Rebecca Sanderson, the deputy mayor who had turned state's evidence. "Professor Winters," Sanderson began tentatively, "I wanted to speak with you directly before the news becomes public tomorrow. I've finalized my cooperation agreement with prosecutors." Eleanor listened carefully as Sanderson detailed her testimony, which would implicate both the mayor and Alexander Patterson in directing the scheme against elderly homeowners. Most significantly, she revealed that Patterson had explicitly targeted seniors because their confusion and incompetence makes them ideal acquisition opportunities. He said elderly residents would be too embarrassed to fight back when presented with complex code violations, Sanderson continued, voice tight with evident shame at her own complicity. "He specifically instructed us to use technical language and complicated procedures to overwhelm them." The admission confirmed what Eleanor had suspected from the beginning, that ageism was not incidental to the scheme but its fundamental operating principle. Meridian and city officials had weaponized societal biases about elderly cognition to execute their fraud. "Why are you telling me this directly?" Eleanor asked. Sanderson hesitated. "Because I owe you an apology. When you first raised concerns, I dismissed you as a confused elderly woman making unfounded accusations. I didn't just participate in the scheme, I perpetuated the very prejudice that made it possible." The acknowledgement was significant, not just as evidence for their case, but as recognition of how deeply ageist assumptions had permeated the entire situation. "Apology accepted," Eleanor replied simply. "Though accountability must extend beyond personal regret to systemic change." After hanging up, Eleanor returned to preparing her Harvard speech with renewed purpose. Sanderson's confession had crystallized the broader significance of the Meridian case. It wasn't just about specific instances of fraud, but about challenging fundamental societal biases regarding age and competence. The following morning, news of Sanderson's cooperation agreement dominated local headlines. "Deputy Mayor flips, Patterson targeted seniors for confusion and incompetence," read the Boston Globe's front page. The explicit ageism revealed in Sanderson's testimony sparked public outrage that transcended the specifics of the housing scheme. Eleanor's Harvard Law School address that evening drew an overflow crowd. Students, faculty, and community members packed the auditorium, with additional viewers watching via live stream. As she approached the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation that visibly moved her. "Thank you," she began once the applause subsided. "But I would suggest reserving judgment until after you've heard what I have to say." For the next hour, Eleanor delivered a masterful analysis of how age discrimination functions in contemporary America, not just through explicit policy but through subtle dismissal, patronizing interaction, and systematic underestimation of elderly capabilities. "The Meridian case exemplifies a broader pattern," she explained. "When I first raised concerns about coordination between developers and city officials, I was dismissed not because my evidence was weak, but because my age made me presumptively unreliable." She detailed how this presumptive unreliability created a perfect environment for exploitation. When elderly residents questioned sudden tax increases or code violations, officials responded with technical jargon and patronizing dismissal. This wasn't accidental, it was strategy, designed to create self-doubt that would make victims more vulnerable to pressure. Most powerfully, Eleanor explained how she had strategically used these ageist assumptions against their perpetrators. "They believed I was too confused to build a coherent legal case, too intimidated to challenge powerful interests, too isolated to create collective resistance. Their underestimation became my greatest advantage." The audience listened enrapt. Attention as she concluded with a call to action directed particularly at the law students present. The prejudice you've witnessed in this case, the assumption that age diminishes competence, credibility, and capacity, persists throughout our legal system and broader society. As future attorneys, you have a unique opportunity to challenge these biases, to ensure that elderly voices are heard rather than dismissed, and to recognize that experience can be a source of wisdom rather than obsolescence. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes. As Eleanor gathered her notes, she was surrounded by students and faculty eager to continue the conversation. Among them was a silver-haired woman who identified herself as the dean of the law school. "Professor Winters," she said warmly, "that was the most insightful analysis of age discrimination I've heard in 30 years of legal scholarship. Would you consider developing it into a more formal lecture series for our students?" The invitation represented something Eleanor hadn't anticipated, the transformation of her individual legal battle into a platform for broader education and advocacy. By sharing her experience and analysis with future lawyers, she could potentially influence how the legal system approached elderly citizens for decades to come. As she drove home that evening, Eleanor reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. From isolated retirement to leading a landmark legal case. From being dismissed as confused to being sought after for her expertise. From fighting individual injustice to challenging systemic prejudice. The brownstone came into view, its familiar facade now representing not just her personal home but a symbol of resistance against exploitation. The lights were on inside, Caroline waiting up despite the late hour, her presence a reminder that Eleanor was no longer fighting alone. Elder Justice Warrior remained uncomfortable. "I'm a lawyer who recognized injustice and had the training to address it," she answered carefully. "If my actions inspire others to challenge discrimination, I'm grateful. But this case has always been about principles rather than personalities, about establishing that age should never diminish one's right to justice." As the impromptu press conference concluded, Margaret Holloway approached with several other members of Silver Advocates for Housing Justice. Their transformation over the past months had been remarkable, from isolated, demoralized victims to confident, organized advocates. "We've been invited to testify before the state legislature's Committee on Elder Affairs," Margaret announced proudly. "They're considering a comprehensive Elder Housing Protection Act based on the reforms in our settlement." Eleanor beamed with genuine pride. This expansion of impact, from courtroom to legislature, from individual case to statutory protection, represented exactly the systemic change she had hoped might emerge from their struggle. "That's wonderful news. Your personal testimony will be powerful in shaping effective legislation." Richard Chambers nodded enthusiastically. "We're also launching chapters in 5 additional cities where we've identified similar patterns of exploitation. Turns out what happened in Boston wasn't unique. Developers across the country have been using these tactics against elderly homeowners." The national scaling of their advocacy efforts represented another unexpected outcome of Eleanor's initial stand. What began as her solitary investigation had catalyzed a movement that was now spreading organically, empowering elderly citizens across the country to recognize and resist exploitation. Later that evening, Eleanor hosted a small gathering at her brownstone, not a celebration exactly, but a moment of collective acknowledgement for the journey they had undertaken together. Caroline had arranged a modest spread of refreshments in the living room, now returned to its original function after months of serving as legal headquarters. Michael raised his glass in a toast to Professor Winters, who reminded an entire legal community that wisdom accumulates rather than diminishes with age. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "To all of us, who demonstrated that justice is possible even against powerful interests. When people refuse to be silenced." As conversations flowed around her, Eleanor found herself drawn to the window overlooking Beacon Hill. The neighborhood remained in transition, new construction alongside historic homes, development reshaping the community's character. But now that development would proceed under watchful eyes, with protections ensuring that elderly residents couldn't be manipulated or displaced through coordinated harassment. Caroline joined her mother at the window. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was just reflecting on how differently things might have unfolded if I'd accepted their initial dismissal," Eleanor replied. "If I'd internalized their assumption that I was too old to understand what was happening, too confused to document it effectively, too powerless to challenge it meaningfully." "But you didn't," Caroline said simply. "You used their underestimation against them." Eleanor nodded. "That's what I hope others take from this case, not just the legal precedents or policy reforms, but the fundamental recognition that age brings perspective and experience that can be powerful tools for justice." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the U.S. Attorney's office. Eleanor listened intently before thanking the caller and hanging up. Alexander Patterson has agreed to plead guilty to federal charges, she announced to the room. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he'll provide evidence against officials in 3 other cities where Meridian operated similar schemes. The news was significant not just for their case but for potential victims across the country. Patterson's cooperation would likely reveal patterns of corruption that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. He finally realized his position was untenable, Michael observed. The evidence was too comprehensive, the witnesses too credible, the pattern too obvious to deny. It's remarkable how thoroughly they underestimated you, Margaret added, shaking her head. They really believed that your age made you an easy target rather than a formidable opponent. Eleanor smiled slightly. Their assumption wasn't entirely unreasonable. Society constantly reinforces the message that aging diminishes capacity, that elderly voices deserve less attention, that older citizens are burdens rather than contributors. But that's precisely what makes your victory so significant, Richard interjected. You didn't just win a case, you challenged a pervasive cultural narrative about aging. As the evening progressed, the conversation shifted from the specific details of their legal battle to broader questions about age discrimination in American society. The group, ranging in age from Caroline's 43 to Margaret's 84, shared experiences of being dismissed, underestimated, or patronized because of age. The most insidious aspect is how it affects self-perception, Irene Chambers observed. After hearing repeatedly that you're confused or incompetent because of your age, you begin to doubt your own observations and judgments. Exactly, Eleanor agreed. That self-doubt is what made so many elderly homeowners vulnerable to Meridian's tactics. When officials dismissed their concerns with technical jargon and patronizing attitudes, they began questioning their own understanding rather than the officials' integrity. So how do we change that? Asked a law student who had worked as a volunteer on the case. How do we address discrimination that's so deeply embedded in cultural attitudes? Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. We start by recognizing that ageism is as real and harmful as other forms of discrimination. We challenge assumptions about elderly competence when we encounter them. We create opportunities for elderly voices to be heard rather than dismissed. She gestured toward the documents still covering one corner of her dining room table. And sometimes, we use the legal system to establish that exploiting age-based vulnerabilities carries significant consequences. As the gathering began to disperse, Eleanor received one final visitor, Judge Rivera, the special master who had overseen the discovery process. Now that the case was resolved, such a visit no longer presented ethical concerns. Professor Winters, he greeted her warmly. I wanted to personally express my admiration for how you constructed this case. In 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such methodical documentation of a complex conspiracy. Thank you, Robert, Eleanor replied, their formal titles giving way to the collegiality of long acquaintance. Though I suspect you would have been equally thorough if our positions had been reversed. He smiled slightly. Perhaps. But I might not have been as effective in leveraging the very prejudice being weaponized against me. Your strategic insight in using their ageist assumptions to gain advantage was masterful. His observation captured something essential about Eleanor's approach throughout the case. Rather than directly confronting ageist attitudes, she had initially allowed Meridian and city officials to believe their own narrative, that she was merely a confused elderly woman posing no serious threat. That misperception had given her time to build an airtight case before they recognized the danger she represented. I've been invited to speak at the National Judicial Conference, Judge Rivera continued. I'd like to use this case as a model for how courts should approach claims involving age discrimination, particularly when it intersects with property rights and municipal authority. His request highlighted another dimension of their victory, its potential to influence how judges nationwide approached similar cases. If Eleanor's experience could help other courts recognize and address age-based exploitation, its impact would extend far beyond Boston. After all visitors had departed, Eleanor and Caroline sat in comfortable silence in the living room. The house felt different somehow, not just restored to its residential function after months as legal headquarters, but imbued with deeper meaning as the site where a significant battle for justice had been coordinated and won. What will you do now? Caroline asked eventually. Return to quiet retirement? Eleanor laughed softly. I think that ship has sailed. The settlement established the Elder Justice Legal Clinic at Boston College Law School. They've asked me to serve as founding director. The clinic would provide free legal representation to elderly citizens facing discrimination or exploitation while training law students to recognize and address age-based vulnerabilities. It represented an ideal fusion of Eleanor's teaching experience and her newfound advocacy role. That sounds perfect, Caroline observed. transforming your individual experience into ongoing institutional support for others. Plus, Eleanor added with a slight smile, it gives me a platform to ensure that what happened here isn't forgotten or repeated. The following morning, Eleanor woke early and followed her ritual of coffee on the front steps, watching her neighborhood come alive with morning activity. The familiar routine felt precious after months when her home had been threatened, not just the physical structure but what it represented: independence, continuity, connection to community. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Michael, just confirmed. What had begun as one woman's stand against corruption had evolved into something much larger, a movement challenging fundamental assumptions about age, competence, and power. The developer and officials who had believed Eleanor too old to understand their scheme had inadvertently created their most formidable opponent, unleashing a force for justice that extended far beyond one neighborhood or one case. As Eleanor climbed the steps to her front door, she moved with the confidence of someone who had reclaimed not just her property rights but her rightful place as a valued, respected voice in the community. Age had not diminished her, it had equipped her with precisely the wisdom, experience, and perspective needed to recognize injustice and craft an effective response. The battle was far from over, but its significance had expanded beyond anything she could have initially imagined. What remained consistent was the principle that had guided her from the beginning: the refusal to be silenced, dismissed, or underestimated because of her age. The federal courthouse in Boston stood imposing against the autumn sky, its neoclassical columns and broad steps projecting the timeless authority of American justice. On this crisp October morning, the building had drawn an unusual crowd. Elderly citizens standing shoulder to shoulder with law students, housing advocates, and media representatives, all gathered for what the Boston Globe had dubbed the Elder Justice Reckoning. Inside courtroom 3, Eleanor Winters sat at the plaintiff's table reviewing her notes one final time before proceedings began. 6 months had passed since she had first discovered the pattern of fraud targeting elderly homeowners. What had started as her solitary stand against corruption had evolved into a landmark case with far-reaching implications for elder rights nationwide. Nervous? Michael Chen asked, adjusting his tie as he settled beside her. Eleanor smiled. Slightly. I stopped experiencing courtroom nerves sometime around 1985. After you've argued before the Supreme Court, everything else feels relatively manageable. Caroline, seated directly behind the railing, leaned forward. The Attorney General just arrived. And there's a representative from the White House Elder Justice Initiative. The high-profile presence underscored how significantly the case had expanded. What began as a local dispute over property values had evolved into a national conversation about age-based discrimination and elder exploitation. Federal prosecutors had built a RICO case against Meridian Development and key city officials. State authorities had pursued civil rights violations. Eleanor's class action lawsuit represented dozens of elderly victims seeking justice and compensation. Today marked the culmination of these parallel legal tracks, a settlement hearing that would establish both accountability and remedy. Judge Harrington entered the courtroom, his measured stride and direct gaze commanding immediate silence. Good morning, he began after taking his seat. We're here to consider the proposed global settlement in Winters versus Meridian Development et al. This settlement encompasses the private class action, state civil rights claims, and terms of the federal deferred prosecution agreement. He glanced toward Eleanor with respectful acknowledgement. Professor Winters, as lead plaintiff and class representative, would you like to address the court regarding the proposed terms? Eleanor rose with the dignified composure that had become her trademark throughout these proceedings. At 71, she stood straighter than many attorneys half her age, her voice carrying the authority of decades in lecture halls and courtrooms. Thank you, Your Honor. The proposed settlement represents a comprehensive approach to both accountability and restoration. Rather than detail each provision, I'd like to focus on its 3 foundational elements. She stepped from behind the table, commanding the courtroom's attention without technological aids or dramatic gestures, just the measured confidence of someone who knew precisely the weight of each word she chose. First, financial restitution. Meridian Development will establish a $45 million compensation fund for elderly homeowners who sold properties under duress. Independent appraisers will determine fair market value at time of sale, with affected homeowners receiving the difference between that amount and what they were paid, plus an additional 30% for emotional distress. Eleanor paused, allowing the magnitude of the figure to register. When she had first filed her complaint, such an outcome had seemed impossible, a lone elderly woman extracting meaningful accountability from a powerful corporation and entrenched city officials. Second, structural reform. The settlement mandates the creation of an elder housing protection unit within the state attorney general's office, funded for 20 years by penalties assessed against Meridian and the city. This unit will monitor development activities, investigate patterns of code enforcement, and ensure that elderly homeowners receive fair treatment in all property-related matters. The institutional reform represented a fundamental shift in how elderly homeowners would be protected going forward, not dependent on individual vigilance but enshrined in governmental structure. Finally, accountability. While the financial and structural components are vital, equally important is the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The settlement requires Meridian and city officials to admit they deliberately targeted elderly homeowners because of ageist assumptions about their competence and capacity to resist. This last element had been the most fiercely contested during negotiations. Meridian's attorneys had fought desperately to avoid any admission that would explicitly acknowledge exploiting age-based vulnerabilities. But Eleanor had remained firm. Without public accountability, the settlement would fail to address the underlying prejudice that had enabled the scheme. Your Honor, the class representatives have voted unanimously to accept these terms. While no settlement can fully restore what was taken, the homes that held decades of memories, the communities that provided essential support, the sense of security that was violated, these provisions establish both meaningful compensation and lasting protection for future generations of elderly homeowners. Judge Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Professor Winters. Does counsel for Meridian Development wish to address the court? Alexander Patterson's attorney rose, his expression professionally neutral despite representing a client now facing both financial penalty and reputational catastrophe. Your Honor, Meridian accepts the proposed terms and acknowledges the conduct described in the settlement agreement. His careful phrasing, technically complying with the admission requirement while avoiding emotionally resonant language, illustrated how hard-fought each word of the settlement had been. The hearing continued for another hour as representatives from various stakeholder groups addressed the court. The federal prosecutor outlined how the settlement complemented the criminal proceedings against individual executives and officials. The Attorney General explained how the new Elder Housing Protection Unit would function. A representative from Silver Advocates for Housing Justice, the organization Eleanor's former neighbors had created, presented statistics on similar schemes operating nationwide. Finally, Judge Harrington spoke the words that transformed months of negotiation into binding resolution. Having reviewed the proposed settlement and heard from all parties, I find the terms to be fair, reasonable, and adequate. The settlement is hereby approved. The gavel's decisive crack echoed through the courtroom, marking the formal conclusion of a legal battle that had consumed Eleanor's life for half a year. As the audience erupted in subdued applause, she remained seated, momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Caroline squeezed her shoulder. You did it, Mom. Actually, you more than did it, you transformed a personal injustice into systemic change. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered in anticipation. Eleanor emerged into autumn sunlight. Flanked by Caroline and Michael, her expression serene despite the cameras and microphones thrust toward her. Professor Winters, how does it feel to win such a comprehensive victory? Called out a reporter from the local news. Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. This isn't my victory alone. It belongs to every elderly person who found the courage to speak up after being dismissed, to every advocate who recognized that age discrimination remains pervasive in our society, and to every official who chose accountability over cover-up. What message do you have for Meridian and other developers who might consider similar tactics? Asked another journalist. That age is not a vulnerability to be exploited but an attribute to be respected, Eleanor replied firmly. The assumption that elderly citizens are confused, incompetent, or easily intimidated is not just morally wrong but, as this case demonstrates, legally dangerous. A young reporter from a national outlet pushed forward. You've become a symbol for elderly Americans standing up against discrimination. How does that role feel? The question gave Eleanor pause. Throughout her career, she had focused on legal principles rather than personal recognition, on systemic justice rather than individual acclaim. The public attention, articles profiling her as the professor who outsmarted City Hall or first compensation checks going out to class members next week. You've changed lives, Professor. The message prompted reflection on how thoroughly her own life had been transformed since discovering that first suspicious pattern of tax reassessments and code violations. What began as her personal stand against intimidation had catalyzed changes she could never have anticipated: federal prosecution of corrupt officials, creation of new protective institutions, emergence of a national advocacy network, evolution of legal precedent regarding elder exploitation. Most significantly, the case had challenged prevailing narratives about aging in America. Through her actions, Eleanor had demonstrated that elderly citizens could be not just capable but formidable when defending their rights. She had revealed that experience and perspective gained through decades of living could provide unique advantages in confronting injustice. A young woman jogged past, pausing momentarily to wave at Eleanor. "You're Professor Winters, right? I saw you on the news. What you did was amazing." The brief interaction exemplified the shift in how Eleanor was perceived, no longer just an elderly resident easily dismissed or overlooked, but someone whose actions commanded respect regardless of age. Later that morning, Eleanor visited Boston College Law School to discuss establishing the Elder Justice Legal Clinic. Walking across the campus where she had taught for decades, she noticed students pointing her out to each other, their expressions conveying admiration rather than the indifference typically directed toward elderly visitors. The dean greeted her warmly in his office. "Professor Winters, thank you for considering our proposal. The clinic represents an extraordinary opportunity to translate your recent experiences into institutional framework." "I'm honored by the invitation," Eleanor replied. "But I want to ensure the clinic addresses the full spectrum of age-based discrimination, not just housing issues." For the next hour, they outlined a comprehensive vision for the clinic, providing direct representation to elderly clients facing exploitation while simultaneously conducting research, developing policy recommendations, and training future attorneys to recognize and address age discrimination. "We see this as potentially transformative," the dean explained. "Most law students graduate with minimal exposure to elder law despite demographic trends making it increasingly significant. Your leadership would help establish this field as essential rather than peripheral to legal education." As their meeting concluded, the dean asked a question that caught Eleanor by surprise. "Beyond the practical impact of your case, what personal lesson do you hope others might learn from your experience?" Eleanor considered carefully before responding. "That age can be a source of strength rather than vulnerability. That the very characteristics society often dismisses in elderly citizens, persistence, methodical approach, historical perspective, can become powerful tools for justice when properly applied." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Most importantly, that no one should ever accept being underestimated or dismissed because of age. Sometimes being underestimated creates the very opportunity needed to prove how wrong that assessment truly is." Walking home through the historic streets of Boston, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a retired professor living quietly in her brownstone, increasingly marginalized by a society that equated age with irrelevance. Today, she stood at the center of a movement challenging fundamental assumptions about elderly competence and capacity. The transformation hadn't come from denying her age or attempting to embody youthful attributes. Rather, it had emerged from embracing the unique perspective, experience, and wisdom that 71 years of living had provided. The very characteristic that Meridian and city officials had assumed would make her an easy target had instead made her an exceptionally dangerous opponent. As Eleanor approached her brownstone, the home she had successfully defended against corruption and greed, she noticed a small gathering on her steps. Former neighbors, law students who had volunteered on the case, and community advocates stood holding a banner, "Thank you Professor Winters, Elder Justice Champion." The simple gesture of gratitude brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Beyond the legal victory, beyond the policy reforms, beyond the institutional changes, she had helped restore dignity and agency to elderly citizens who had been systematically disrespected and exploited. They had said she was too old to understand what was happening in her neighborhood. Instead, she had understood not just the mechanics of the scheme but its psychological foundations, its legal vulnerabilities, and the strategic approaches needed to dismantle it effectively. In doing so, Eleanor Winters hadn't just won a court case, she had challenged a cultural narrative that diminished the value and capability of elderly citizens. She had demonstrated that age could be not just a demographic characteristic but a powerful platform for creating meaningful change. As she climbed the steps to join the impromptu gathering, Eleanor moved with the confidence of someone who had reclaimed not just her property rights but her rightful place as a valued, respected voice in society. She had transformed from victim to advocate, from target to champion, from isolated individual to movement leader. They had believed her too old to understand their scheme. She had proven herself precisely old enough to dismantle it completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.